you so much. Thank you. And so let's go ahead and begin. I'm Maha Elgenaidi, and I'm the Executive Director of ING. It's known as ING, which stands for Islamic Networks Group. We've been around for 26 years and primarily do work on religious literacy with a focus on Islamic literacy. So we educate about Muslims and their faith by supplementing very specific content standards in the national standards and in state standards as well. And we do hundreds of these inside classrooms. Post 9/11, we started doing the same work in an interfaith setting or in the context of religious pluralism. So now we have panels where Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Buddhists and Hindus go out together to supplement those content standards in the social studies. And that's been phenomenal. We also do the same work in school districts. So we do a lot of educator training and admin training, and that's how I got here. I met Kathy. We did a training for them, for the Santa Clara County Department of Education leadership, and she said, you have to be here. And I was happy to be here. But the focus, I think, on this conference is not so much on the cultural, ethnic, or religious diversity as the San Diego one is expected to be. That's the one that's happening in January. And more recently, in the last 2 to 3 years, seeing this intense polarization that we're seeing in the country around all sorts of issues, but also race, we now have a new bureau that's going to look at Islamophobia in the context of anti-blackness, anti-immigrant, anti-Latino, anti-Hispanic sentiment, and anti-Semitism as well, by going back in history. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that, where we go all the way back to the period of colonialism when these narratives were created about non-whites primarily, and also about whites, but privileging, certainly these narratives privileged whites over Asians and blacks and Arabs and Middle Easterners and Indians and so forth. And that's been an incredible experience for us, and people are really resonating with the content, which is pretty remarkable, because we also do work with law enforcement, with healthcare facilities, and corporations. So, and we do Rotary clubs, houses of worship, and so forth. And you know, people have been resonating with that conversation. I think people now, Americans, are ready to have a conversation about race. It just has to be done in a way that isn't blaming or blameworthy, but that it addresses the problem as a shared problem that we all need to work together on. Because these narratives that we're living by, that we're swimming in, that's being reinforced by society, are not narratives that we created, but it's been imposed upon us for centuries. You know, why we see blacks the way that we do, why we you know, see Hispanics and Latinos the way that we do, why we see Muslims and Arabs the way that we do. I was just in another workshop, and one of the inclusive workshops, and the trainer asked us to share an uncomfortable experience. And I was one of 2 people that shared. It was the same exact issue. The fact is that the workshop was packed. It had you know, 12 tables, and all the tables were filled. And I had come in early, and on my table, no one sat with me. All the way up until the trainer was about to begin, and so there were no other seats. So 2 women came, and they were together. So my table had the only, you know, 2 chairs together. And I shared that, and I said, this is actually a common experience for women in hijab, Muslim women in hijab. And this is a conference on, you know, on inclusion. So I think you know, they got the point. But this is, you know, why? You know, why do things like this happen? And I think for a lot of people, it's a visceral reaction, and that's what this new bureau that we've developed addresses, this visceral reaction that we have to certain types of people or members of a particular group. So that's what we do as an organization. We have chapters in different parts of the country. We have a great one in Michigan. It's incredibly active. Not in New Hampshire, or maybe there are people that you.
There's a lot going on in New Hampshire.
Fantastic.
So like there are a lot of immigrants.
Yeah.
And they've come in to work, and there, there've been a lot of incidents. So there's a definite effort around anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Certainly racial, but also
Islamophobia issues. Well, we need to be connected with them, and we have a great chapter also in Colorado. Yes, that I can connect you to, and they do essentially the same kind of work that we do here. So this is understanding Muslim students, fostering an inclusive environment. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. And the purpose of this workshop is to highlight the current environment, political, social environment that impacts. Oh, I have to stay here within this space? Oh, okay, thank you. I didn't know that. Nobody told me this. So highlight the challenges that Muslim students and their families are facing today, and then suggest remedies in school policies, personal awareness, which is probably the most important thing that we can do for educators, quite honestly, on dealing with this population, and then address reasonable accommodations, as you would with Jewish students or Catholic students or other religious students, and with educator resources, which would really only apply to social studies and world history. But it's essentially good for you to also know. I'm going to address the current environment first, then go into the impact, then address the remedies, and then end with educator resources. What's the current environment for Muslim Americans? As you might imagine, it's not very good. So we look at several polls. We don't look at just one poll, and we've been tracking this information now, these types of studies for a very long time, since we started the organization, which was in 1993. And things really have gotten worse. They haven't gotten better, despite the fact that post 9/11, many Muslim American organizations did a lot more outreach than they did before 9/11. But there are reasons for that, which we're gonna talk about. But one of the polls that keeps getting done every year is the one by Pew Poll that looks at perceptions that Americans have of religious groups, and Muslims always do the worst. Muslim Americans always do the worst, despite their demographics, and the demographics are, they're well educated, they're in white collar professions. Something like 25% of doctors are immigrants, and a lot of them are Muslim Americans. Despite their economic status, their education level, and the fact that they've been here. My family came in the 60s. They're still racially profiled. They're still discriminated against. I like to use the example of President Obama. So, President Obama is one of those people that, a Black American who's made it. And I can mention also Latinos and other members of different ethnic and religious groups. Despite that, we're still racially profiled. The rating is pretty poor. The only good news is the fact that if you know a Muslim, someone from a particular group that's being discriminated against, the better perceptions that you have of them. And why engagement, why conferences like this become really important. Because the key is interaction. Not only interaction, but also learning something about that group. And in the case of religious groups, I think learning something about the religion itself and how it's related to other religions helps immensely. All the other polls suggest exactly the same thing. What are the sources of these negative stereotypes? I'm going to go to the history. There's the history of Islamophobia, which is really Islamophobia is nothing more than neo-Orientalism. You might be familiar with the concept of Orientalism, the way that the Academy portrayed people from Muslim majority nations or Muslim majority regions around the world. Those images that we had back then continue to be recycled, and they are identical to the images that we have of Muslims today, or Arabs today, around extremism and terrorism, around misogyny, towards women, intolerance towards other religions, people that are not civilized, that are barbaric. All of those images that we usually associate with Muslims and anyone who's perceived to be Muslims are recycled images from that period of time. And I think that this is incredibly important to understand. Let me quickly switch over to another PowerPoint that isn't really part of this presentation, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that this is not a problem that just concerns Muslims and Arabs, but it really concerns a lot of other groups of people that are racialized in a particular way, and attributes are associated with these racial groups. So someone like President Obama, or a mayor, a Muslim mayor, who is returning from a trip abroad, he's racially profiled. He's held up by TSA, and his background is checked in. This is a Muslim mayor in New Jersey, profiled, detained, and questioned at the airport. Where does it come from? I think that we have to look at the genealogies of bigotry, and I think that in order for really to overcome and dismantle these negative perceptions and what they lead into, which is biases that we have, we use the term implicit bias. It comes from that, where despite the values that you have, you may consider yourself not to be a racist or absolutely against racism. You find it to be abhorrent to be a racist and to judge people based on their gender or based on their race or religion or color of skin. But because these biases that we have are so deeply ingrained and we've lived with them ever since we started going to school, it really gets embedded in public education in this country, that your visceral reaction towards people is what drives your behavior, much more than your values. And studies have shown this, that your implicit bias drives behavior, which is why many Americans will say, I'm not a racist, I don't believe in racism, but yet their behavior might actually be counter to that. So we have to look at the colonialism period and what happens there, and the racialization. Colonialism, European colonialism, is mostly by these nations here. Their motives and justifications were what they were, but when you look at how they portrayed the people that were colonized, it's the same images that we have of them today. Blacks, Asians, Native Americans, right? And the same thing with, with women. And then juxtaposing those images with how we view Europeans, Canadians, Australians, right? And justifying it is through the process of racialization. Racialization is when you group entire groups of people based on their physical characteristics, and then you assign certain attributes to them, and then you place them in a hierarchy. And it usually privileges European Americans or white folks. Let me just finish this thought really quickly. So Muslims are not really defined by anything other than, and we even refer to them as Muslims, other than their religion. So how many, where do Muslims live in the world today? They live in 55 Muslim majority countries. How many actually knew that? 55 Muslim majority countries, right? It's about 1/4. They number about 1/4 of the world's population, about 1.8 to 2 billion people that are spread out in 55 Muslim majority countries. And then we have sizable minority populations. China is one. Russia is another. Half of Malaysia is Muslim. You have sizable minority Muslim populations throughout European countries. Here in the United States, we are one of the 2 largest religious minorities in the United States, right? So you have tremendous diversity, but yet when you lump all of them together and identify them as Muslims, it becomes really easy then to assign certain attributes or characteristics to them. We do the same thing with Africans, right? How many nations are there in Africa? But usually when people are traveling throughout Africa, they don't name the nation, the country that they're in, or even the city. They just say, oh, I've been in Africa, and everybody understands what that means, right? Native Americans, despite the distinct tribes and the different languages that they spoke, we refer to Native Americans as Native Americans. Hindus, same thing. Hinduism comes about because the British go into India, they lump all of these tribal religions together and call it Hinduism, right? Which has been a struggle for Hindus today in trying to change the way that Hinduism is taught in schools. Because we're using these same templates of how we define a people. And this is now reinforced historically. Science was used to reinforce it, and I think, you know, in some corners today, science is still being used to reinforce these racial hierarchies. But education system, I think, plays a huge role, where there's an erasure of history. One of the reasons why we exist as an organization is because nothing is really taught about the history of Muslims in the United States. The fact that Muslims have been here since the enslaved Africans. It's estimated, a conservative estimate is that 1/5 of the enslaved Africans were Muslim, but there are other estimates that go up as high as 1/3 of the enslaved Africans were Muslim, right? And then the many contributions these Africans made to American culture, American society. Or the fact that during the Dark Ages of Europe, it was the height of civilization in the Muslim world, right? That's not really taught at all. We don't cover the many contributions that Muslim civilization or Islamic civilization makes to the Renaissance and European society. That's why our organization does what we do. We actually have presentations that supplement those content standards or that curriculum that is supposed to be taught, but it's absent from textbooks. So erasure of history plays a huge role in reinforcing these images, misrepresentation in popular culture, and then also in media coverage and government policies. Think about how, or media articles, news articles about Africa or about Latin American countries or about China or India, certainly about the Middle East, right? They all tend to be one-dimensional, and it's only when they behave badly, right? And compare that or juxtapose that with how we cover European countries and Australia and Canada. So all of that, unfortunately, leads to internalization of these negative perceptions, which leads to what we call today implicit bias. I think in order for us to teach against implicit bias, we really have to uncover the roots of it. We really do. Just, for people to understand that these images are not there because of the fault of the people that we have implicit bias about, but it's because of these images that have been created in our minds, where when you see an African American male, you have all of these assumptions and ideas about them that have nothing to do with reality, have everything to do with what we've been taught about African American males, or about Muslims, or about Latinos, or Asians. And so I have Asian friends that have been here for 3 centuries, 2 to 3 centuries, and people are still asking them whether they speak English or not, or how come you speak such good English? And they've been here a lot longer than many European Americans. How is this continuing to happen? Why does this happen? I think it happens from this period right here. Yes, you had a question, but he has to come with a microphone though, before you do that.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So I've been trying to answer this question about race, and I got into it, and then I kind of forgot about it. But you're an expert, so maybe you can answer this. Why, if you are married to an African American, you have biracial children if you have children. But if you're married to a Muslim who hails from Asia or, Africa, or they're not considered biracial. I'm very confused about that, or at
Because-
least that's what I've been told.
Yeah, because Islam is a religion. It's not a race.
No, I don't
Oh.
mean Islam. I
Oh.
mean, it was just picking. I was saying like a Muslim from, from India. Why aren't they biracial? They're brown people. They're not white people. So if a white woman,
If they
Yeah.
marry a white,
I mean, this is what I've heard. I've only
yeah,
heard
no, they-
biracial in terms of African Americans. So I didn't know if you've had an answer to that, but
not
I've
at
always
all.
been.
Not at all. It sounds to me like maybe it's a personal issue involving that family. They don't consider them to be biracial. But
No, it's actually what I've looked up in academic things. They don't call. All right, I was married to a Pakistani. He's a Muslim. I have 2 children. They're
Yeah.
not considered biracial. But I have a son-in-law from Ghana.
who doesn't consider them biracial?
Anyone who, if I
Is-
tried to say my kids are biracial, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And just even in common talk, but my son-in-law is Ghanaian American. His kids are considered biracial.
Yeah, considered by who?
So-
by census or
Yeah,
by? By-
in schools and census, even people who know racial history.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
It doesn't.
It
So
doesn't
I'm
make any
sorry, I
sense.
don't mean to take you
Yeah,
off
yeah.
track. I just
Yeah,
wondered
yeah,
if
so
you could answer
yeah,
that.
I honestly.
Falls under white. I have my father was Middle Eastern, and it falls under that white category when you are filling things out on a lot of paperwork.
Well, but
and
that's
when you're-
because Arabs are considered to be
Yes.
Caucasian in the
Yes.
census, unfortunately.
But not in Pakistan.
Yeah, Pakistan is not. Yeah, Pakistan is considered
it
Asian.
falls under
That would
there,
be
but it
considered
doesn't
Asian.
necessarily
Yeah,
make sense.
yeah, yeah.
It's very different.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So I have a nephew who's Arab, married to a Bengali, and their children are definitely considered to be biracial. So yeah, yeah. What? It's-
If they're how could they be considered biracial if a white man marries a Pakistani woman and that's not biracial?
yeah. I don't know.
So maybe I'm just,
Yeah.
I'm in all the wrong places. Sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't take you off.
Yeah. So the sources of negative perceptions, I think it's remarkably important that if you teach against this, if you're teaching people about it, you really do have to go back in history and to try to help people understand that a lot of the perceptions that we have about people today, the narratives that we know about a people today are not created by us. They're not, and they may have absolutely no basis in reality whatsoever. And that we need to treat people as individuals, right? And judge them based on their actual behavior, not based on perceptions that we have about them. And that's how you overcome implicit bias. And then xenophobia, the fear of the other, and xenophobic policies, especially in the last couple of years, I think absolutely contributes, because if you view Muslims, and there are many perceptions about Muslims as being the other, not American, not belonging here, their values are in contrast to our values. That was one of the surveys. They asked the question about whether Muslims belong here. Are their values resonant with American values? And 1 out of 2 Americans believe that they're not resonant with American values. So if you view Muslims as not belonging here, that would intersect with the fear of the other, right? You don't want Muslims to be here or to belong here, or there's a fear of them that if they are here, they could ruin the country's culture. And that's sort of being played out right now, I think, in this political environment that we're in. And then we talked about popular culture and news media that continue to reinforce these negative images. So what kind of impact does that have on Muslim Americans? Of course, it's incredibly negative, unfortunately. Nearly half of all American Muslims and 64% of those who identify, that would be someone like me who wears the hijab, who's easily identified as a Muslim, say that they've experienced a discrimination over the past year. And that's a very real thing. That's a very real thing. On the positive side, as I said, once you know someone who is a Muslim, you tend to have better perceptions about them. And then we've seen a rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes and incidences. I'm going to share just one. There's a lot of information on this on this slide. But in 2017, there were 144 anti-mosque incidences. That's about 12 a year, 12 a month, 12 a month. If this was happening against churches, if this was happening against synagogues, I think that there would have been a much greater outcry about this being a major problem. But this is about, and it continues to happen around the country. The impact on Muslim students is the same. 1 out of 2 Muslim students has experienced some form of harassment, some form of bullying, some form of abuse. Is it getting better? According to a survey that just came out by the organization behind this, it showed that 40% of Muslim kids, or kids that identify as Muslim, have experienced some form of bullying. But when you add the bullying that happens against Sikhs, the bullying that happens against Hindus, and other people who are mistakenly believed to be Muslim, the numbers are much higher. Mainly racially and religiously motivated verbal bullying, being called names like terrorists. Are you going to bomb us? Comments that are usually made in unmonitored areas such as hallways, playground, cafeteria. Another thing that happens often that is reported by Muslim kids is their discomfort with classroom conversations about issues involving Muslims or in any way related to Muslims, especially around discussions of current events. That has gone up by 50% between 2014 and 2016. Classroom discussions about current events often focus on us versus them. Arabs and Muslims are usually viewed as the enemy. And then there's a lack of sensitivity towards civilians who died in Muslim lands. That could be people that are related to the kids that are sitting in the classroom. And of course, Muslim students are usually pointed to and asked to be the experts, to sort of, what's your opinion, Muhammad? What's your opinion, Layla, about these issues? And a lot of these kids are American kids born and raised here, and they know as much as their neighbor. And then oftentimes they're conflicted about or ashamed of their identity. 38% reported offensive comments about their religion by teachers and administrators. Yeah, so this is a common complaint by students, that the adults in the school, the adults in the school district, are often the cause, or they don't do anything about it when they actually see it. I used to work with the Obama administration, Department of Education, on bullying prevention work, and this was something that came up quite often. You want to address this problem, you really actually have to work with the teachers and the educators, not so much with the kids, because the adults in the room can really make a difference in how they respond to these things when they actually happen. And God forbid if they're the ones who are instigated, if they're the ones who are making the mistakes. More than 50% of Muslim students see other students posting offensive statements about Muslims on social media. And there have been other studies that have also shown that Muslim students, Muslim kids, have internalized Islamophobia, where the views that the American public has about Muslims, they've internalized, and they actually believe them to be true themselves. And that's the damage, I think, that we do to children when we don't address these issues. What are the remedies? How am I doing in time? Good. Okay. So it's 2:45, and then I go 3:45. Okay. Okay, good. So remedies to foster inclusion and prevent bullying of Muslim students. School policies is probably the best place to begin. And it's amazing that many of the educators in the school don't know what those policies are, what the law is. This falls under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. And the Education Department has extended these protections to groups with shared ancestry or ethnic background. Now, really interesting that 43% of school staff in NEA, National Education Association poll, said that bullying was a problem. That's nearly half of the educators said that bullying was a problem, but less than 40% of the staff reported being involved in bullying prevention work. So we have a lot of work to do. And we do a lot of training in school districts, and we can tell you that many teachers, many educators that we work with, really well-meaning, well-intentioned, that really don't know what the policies are in their own school district. So that's the first place that I think we need to begin. It's just education about what their school policies are, what the law is. Yeah, so even though you have nearly 60% report their schools have a formal anti-bullying program, they may not have been trained on that bullying program, and they may not be aware of the specifics. So preventing bullying is probably where you would want to begin. Before bullying happened, before harassment or teasing happened, you absolutely want to try to prevent it. There's a great program that we've contributed to called Know Your Classmates that we push out all the time. They have a curriculum that is executed over 5 days. That is absolutely wonderful, where kids first begin to understand who they are and how they self-identify in every way imaginable. They begin with that, and they move towards respecting themselves before they respect the diversity in other people. Address prejudice and its roots in the classroom or school-wide discussions. Have students share their own experiences. Invite guest speakers to address stereotypes, which is why we're huge in terms of the numbers of presentations that we do just in the Bay Area, let alone in all of our chapters. Exhibit sensitivity in classroom discussions in the way that you talk about these issues. Be very sensitive to who's in the classroom when you do. And it becomes incredibly important during crisis situations, of course. And then addressing bullying when it happens immediately. And this is something that every responsible adult needs to do immediately when they recognize it, when they see it. The problem is for them to be able to recognize it first. I've had teachers that have said to students, well, it's their First Amendment rights to say what they, what they just said about Islam and Muslims to this very vulnerable kid. It might be, yes, their First Amendment right, but if it is hurting another human being, and if it's making that kid feel insecure and unsafe, that's when you need to step in and have a conversation to say, why do you feel this way? Where are you getting this information about a person, and are you aware that you're hurting this other person by saying these things? Having zero tolerance policies, mediate bullying immediately, and then it was especially important to hold staff sensitivity or culture diversity workshops, because many of the stereotypes, and I'm going to go through a small exercise here with you where I actually talk about what does Islam teach? And incredibly important for the school staff to know this stuff. For no other reason than for them just to be knowledgeable about their views, and also to do a little bit of the history of why they might have the bias and the stereotypes that they do about a group of people. And so we highly recommend this. And when we've done these trainings, this part is the most highly rated part more than any other part. Because once you develop that understanding, you develop sensitivity, and everything else becomes easy to do. Like you develop respect for the other group. You don't have to accept anybody's religion or anybody's even values, but you absolutely need to respect that person for who they are and what they choose to believe in. So we highly recommend this, and I'm going to give you a mini lesson on that, and just to clarify the terminology that is often associated with Islam and Muslims. All of these terms are often used interchangeably to mean the same things when they don't. Assalamu alaikum means
Greeting, how are you?
exactly. It's a greeting that people use to say peace be unto you. Salam is the same word as Arabic word as the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace. Shalom alaikum is the way that Jews will often greet one another. right? Salamu alaikum is the same thing, peace be unto you, and the response is wa alaikum as-salam, and to you peace also, exactly. And it's also a greeting among Christians. Some Christians will greet each other the same way. And it's supposed to be a form of prayer where you're wishing upon someone peace, and it also helps in the interaction that you're about to have with someone. It sets the tone for that interaction. So you'll often hear Muslims exchange this greeting among each other. But it's the same as the peace be unto you and to you peace also that Christians will exchange. Now, Christians and Jews and Muslims have what in common? One God. And is it the same God? Muslims worship the God of Abraham. Muslims worship the God of Abraham, so it is the same God. The way that I'm dressed is similar to who in the Catholic tradition? Traditionally, nuns, exactly. So Muslim women that choose to dress this way, modestly, the way that we define modesty, is similar to the dress of nuns.
But many women over time. I mean,
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely. Head covering was very much part of it.
Well, it's referenced in the Bible.
It's referenced in the Bible, and Jewish women also. Orthodox Jewish women will dress in very similar ways as well. This is nothing new. This is not foreign. This is actually, Abrahamic. It's, if America is, which I don't agree with that identity, but usually there's some Americans that believe that America is a Judeo-Christian nation. Well, this is very Judeo-Christian. In this, idea of just modest dress. And it's not just about dress, it's also about interaction with the opposite gender, which is supposed to be free of sexuality unless you're married to the individual. And that's the idea behind the dress. It's about protecting families, and working towards creating virtuous communities, virtuous societies, in the way that you interact with the opposite gender that's supposed to be free of sexuality. That's the reason behind the dress being the way that it is. So, in that sense, Islam is not a foreign religion. It's rooted in Abrahamic tradition. Islam is the name of the religion, and it's an Arabic word that means peace by following God's commandments or through following God's commandments. Islamic is an adjective that modifies something that is non-human. You would use it to refer to something that's non-human. History, Islamic culture, Islamic art, Islamic civilization. But you would not refer to a person as an Islamic, which I've seen. Muslim is how you would refer to someone who's a follower of the faith, and both of these words are Arabic word, and the pronunciation is Muslim. It's a soft S. Muslim. An Arab is someone who hails or lives in an Arabic-speaking country. May not be Muslim, could be a Christian, could be Jewish, could be Baha'i, Zoroastrian, could be different religion entirely. So an Arab is someone who comes from an Arabic-speaking country. Arabic is the name of the language that Arabs speak. Arabian functions like Islamic. You would use it to refer to something that is non-human. The Middle East is a region in the world that was defined by European colonialists. And it's predominantly Muslim majority nations. So these terms are very, very different from each other, should not be used interchangeably. Where do Muslims live? They live in 55 Muslim majority countries, as I mentioned earlier, and they represent about a quarter of the world's population, and this is where you get the diversity. In the United States, they are, as I said, one of the two largest religious minorities next to Jews, and the ethnic makeup is what it is, and this is where, why do we have so many whites? Well, because Arabs are considered white. We don't feel white. I'm predominantly Arab, part Turkish. And I also found out, I did my DNA in the Ancestry.com and discovered 18% Black African because I hail from Egypt and my mother is half Turkish, half Egyptian, which I thought was incredible. So I'm African American. Not quite, but I don't want to claim that. But But they're, yeah, so multiracial. There you go. But that's why you have the 41% white. It's because Arabs are considered in the census as being white. But here's an interesting thing. 82% of Muslim Americans are actually US citizens. So I happen to be an immigrant. I came here with my folks, and I'm an immigrant, but I'm an American citizen. So majorities are American citizens, and about nearly half are now American Muslims that are born in the United States. So I don't have any children, but I have a lot of nephews and nieces that were all born here, and they are married and having children. And so we're talking now 2 generations of the immigrants that came in the 60s, but what about all the African Americans? 20% African American Muslims. Can anyone guess what the roots of them are? It's not enslaved Africans.
Oh, I'm sorry. What
The roots of African American Islam. They were formerly Malcolm X, Nation of Islam members, formerly Nation of Islam members. Enslaved Africans were not able to keep their religion, either Islam or whatever religion they belonged to. Many of them had to convert, forced to convert to Christianity. So there isn't a direct link, but in the early part of the last century, in the late 1800s, 1900s, African Americans begin to discover their roots, and many of them actually convert to something that looks like Islam. It was proto-Islamic movements. One of them was the Nation of Islam. And the reason they're not Muslim is because the founder of the nation, W.D. Fard, declared himself to be God, and that his prophet was Elijah Muhammad. But they borrow a lot from Islam. They call themselves Muslims, right? But they also borrowed a lot from Christianity as well. So their services were very different than the way that Muslims, practice, and their ideas as well. But so many of the Black American Muslims that we have today were former Nation of Islam members that convert to mainstream Islam when Elijah Muhammad's son dies, W.D. Muhammad, in the 70s. So the African American Muslims, 20%, many of them are former nation, convert to mainstream Islam. And so someone like me can pray in a predominantly African American mosque. Unfortunately, our mosques, some of our mosques are segregated by race because of their location as well. But most of them are pretty mixed in race. But that's why you have a large population of African American Muslims. The Nation of Islam is not considered to be mainstream by the vast majority, very vast majority of Muslim Americans. So they would not consider Farrakhan as being a representative at all of Islam. And then there's a growing Latino population as well. What does Islam teach? Well, Islam teaches, like the other Abrahamic traditions, the cultivation of moral character, virtuous character. And you'll find them to have the same exact values as other Abrahamic, not only Abrahamic, but also Hindu, Buddhist values. And the origin of Islam is, Islam considers itself to be primordial, beginning with God, who conveys the same foundational message to all of the prophets. And this is where you get the similarities among the Abrahamic traditions. So Muhammad is viewed to be the last messenger of a long line of messengers, beginning with Adam and Eve and ending with Muhammad. So Jesus, Moses, Noah, Abraham. If you read the Quran as an academic, you'll find that all of the prophets are mentioned in the Quran because Muslims see them as being Muslim, conveying the same foundational message. He teaches monotheism and continues the Abrahamic tradition, and this all happens in 576-30. Now, he does in 632, and you can see where the tension comes in now between Muslims and Christians. Right there, it's like, what do you, hey, Jesus is not only our Savior, but he's also God, the Trinity, right? And this begins the history of conflict between the Muslims and the Christian world. There were pockets where they did get along. Islamic Spain is a perfect example of that, where they did live side by side, but Muslims were the ones that were ruling, at the time. And there were some places also where Christians were tolerant, but but Muslims were absolutely tolerant because of the teachings of Islam. And so this is the history. And what do they believe? God, the unseen world, the prophets, all of the holy books, with an emphasis on the Quran, which is Muslims consider to be the final revelation from God. Afterlife, the idea of heaven and hell, and that God knows everything in creation. The way that Muslims practice their faith is they pray 5 times a day. A practicing Muslim would do that. Pray 5 times a day. They required to give part of their wealth to the poor and the needy because they consider everything that they own as being a gift from God, and they have to give something back to the community. So it's not just, it's deeper than charity. It's about feeling an obligation to do that because what you have is a gift anyway from God. Fasting in the month of Ramadan is all about, it's similar to Lent and Yom Kippur for Jews, and Lent, of course, for Catholics. It's all about the cultivation of good moral character. And then the pilgrimage to Mecca is all about commemorating the trials of the Prophet Abraham. It's not about Muhammad, it's about the Prophet Abraham, right? And then the third dimension of Islam is this, working towards virtuous character, to do unto others as you would want to have done. And the golden rule is an ideal, is a principle, is a value, is an objective of all the major world religions. What Jews and Muslims and Christians have in common from a Muslim view is that they all worship the God of Abraham, which is why when you study those 3 religions side by side, you'll see the similarities. My hijab is one of those similarities. Many Americans don't know that. Vast majority of Americans see this as being alien. It's actually very much part of historical Abrahamic tradition, right? What we have in common with Buddhists and Hindus and other religions is the values. Dharma of Buddhism is teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, and in terms of being mindful and cultivating excellent, virtuous character is, really what Buddhism is about, and the same with Hinduism and other, other traditions as well. So now, do you think this would help to know this when you're teaching about Muslims and Islam, or when you're interacting? Absolutely. Suddenly they're not really alien, they're actually pretty rooted in our tradition as Americans. If you're, Jewish or Christian. Common misconceptions are Muslims are monolithic. They're not. They're incredibly diverse. Right? They're diverse in their race, their ethnicity, their national origin. And then when you add to that their upbringing, the kind of family they grew up in, the culture, their political, social background that they grew up in, their education, whether they have an elementary school education or a PhD or a postdoc, their economic status, poor or rich, their religious ideology or political environment, all of that contributes to the diversity. So looking at all Muslims as being one and the same becomes really ridiculous. But look at the media and how it portrays Muslims. It's monolithic, and the way they're usually portrayed also in film is quite negative. Things are getting better. Things are getting better, but it's not going to undo the centuries of it. And then not every Muslim is necessarily a practicing Muslim. There are some that will drink alcohol and that will eat pork. 2 things that you're not supposed to do as a Muslim. Right? But they identify strongly with being Muslim. Or they may do other things, but still identify politically and socially as being Muslim. The whole hijab business of being modest. If you see a lot of young women who wear the hijab, it's with stiletto heels, tight jeans, full makeup on, and then they have the scarf. What is that about? Right? Well, that's the way that they identify. Sometimes Islam for many people is an identity. A lot of young people. It's not necessarily a religious identity. It's a cultural, social, political identity. So keep that in mind with a lot of the kids, right? And then behavior will sometimes contradict religion. What does Islam say about extremism? What do you think it would say? Or terrorism? Moderation is not only encouraged, it's a huge value. So even if you're really religious, you're not supposed to be somebody who lives in a convent and doesn't, not there's anything wrong with living in convents, but the idea is that you're supposed to participate fully in life. You get married, you have children, you work, you earn your living. You're not supposed to spend your days and nights as, in worshiping only. But you are supposed to be mindful, obviously, of the teachings of God. Terrorism is forbidden under any circumstance, let alone, extremism. Moderation is what Muslims should be aiming for. And even in war, there are strict rules for engagement. What about gender? It depends. Now, this issue depends greatly on who you're talking to and what their cultural background is, right? So I'm going to give you the American Muslim liberal version. We're living in the United States, right? So these are things that I could actually cite from the Quran and that I can cite from prophetic tradition. Now you go to Saudi Arabia, some parts of Saudi Arabia, you go some parts of Afghanistan where the Taliban are, or rural Pakistan or rural Egypt, they'll look at this and say, yeah, but it doesn't really apply to our situation, where women's role is X, Y, and Z, and they can even justify it religiously. Why? Because that's the way that religion functions. Religion is functions. It's deeply rooted in culture, right? So it depends on the lens by which somebody is looking at Scripture. That's the way that they will define it. Take Christianity. You know how many denominations of Protestantism we have here? 10,000 denominations. And that is all about the way that Christians interpret the Scripture and the early traditions of Christianity. Even among each of the denominations, like the Baptist, look at the Baptists. You have American Baptists and Southern Baptists, and then you have diversities within these. In the Anglican Church, Episcopalian Church, and the Methodist and the Lutheran, tremendous diversity, and it's really based on the lens, how they interpret their scriptures, and they will differ greatly, and they have separate churches, for that. That's how religion functions, and same thing with Judaism. You have Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Renewal, all sorts of different Judaisms as well. Muslim Americans tend to define women's rights in this way, that men and women are absolutely equal in the eyes of God. They have the same spiritual nature and same humanity. They have equal responsibility and accountability. I don't think that any Muslim can argue otherwise in this area in terms of our obligations and rights, and then how we're going to be held accountable in the hereafter. There's only one heaven and hell. There's not a separate one for men and women. The right to education and employment. Now here's where you get the differences. Like, no. What did the Taliban do when they first took over Afghanistan? They had women stay home. Forget education, forget employment. And to them, it was justifiable until they established whatever an Islamic community would look like for them. And what would women's role be in that Islamic community? I shudder to think what that would look like. An American Muslim woman like me would absolutely be one of the first people to protest that treatment. So these are rights that, as someone like me who has a graduate degree in religious studies, would point to say, no, this is what a woman's rights are. But then again, I'm an American, and I studied with the best scholars in knowing this, right? And when you look at the growing number of Muslim women today who serve in high-level professions, they're doctors, they're engineers, they're lawyers, and so forth. And so a lot of the stuff, especially on women's issues, is really much defined by culture and by economic class and status. So Any questions? I'm going to pause here for a second because I've been talking a lot. Any questions about what I've covered so far before I actually talk about accommodations and the rest of this? Yeah. Oh, thank you for reminding me. You have to leave. So do you have any questions before you leave? No? Okay. Good. So this presentation, part of it is online. And there was supposed to be a handout. It's all digital. Okay, you can download it. And so we have a lot of the links for all of the stuff that we have online.
I don't know if you're going to get to this later, but could you talk about what's going on in China with, I guess it's the Uyghurs?
With the Uyghurs?
Yes.
No, I'm not gonna get into it. But yeah, no, it's horrific. We're getting different media reports that it's up to 2 million Uyghurs that have been taken out of their home, taken out of their communities, and put in what they're calling re-education camps, which are essentially internment camps, and they're actually concentration camps because many of them are being tortured. And I would imagine that those that are resisting what's happening to them are the ones being tortured. But there are people that have escaped, and they're talking to the media about what's happening to them. It is absolutely, it's a nightmare, and nobody's saying anything. I mean, the media is not covering it, and nations that have contracts, that have deals, that are being funded by China are also intimidated in not saying anything. You heard about the NBA, that story where even like our own American companies and American institutions are not saying anything for money. Yeah, for money because of the gains. But yeah, so I haven't interacted directly with the Uyghur community, but I read about what's happening to them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Okay. So now we're going to sort of talk about, accommodations for Muslim students, and of course, you all know that all of this falls under the First Amendment religious clauses. Congress shall make no law establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and therefore, kids have rights to practice their religion in schools. So right to wear religiously mandated clothing or observe dietary rules, and then right to engage in worship as well, and even right to start religious clubs. And they even have a right to inform others about their own religion. The only way that they can't do that is if the school prohibits, for example, distribution of material, any material. Then they can say to the kid, you cannot go around distributing that Bible. Right, but kids pretty much have a lot of rights in school, and so a good school and a good teacher knows that because they've been educated on that, and they would accommodate these students. Dietary, as I mentioned earlier, no pork or pork byproducts, including gelatin, which is made of pork byproducts. Some Muslims only eat halal, which is very close to kosher in terms of how it is produced. And so vegetarian and seafood are very good alternatives. And I think that a lot of schools now have Hindu children, have Buddhist children, and so they already know to make sure. I love the fact that here they had all sorts of food options, food options, from vegan to gluten-free to vegetarian. I thought it was great. And then, of course, no alcohol, and I don't think that that's a major problem in schools. Distinctive attire. Some girls wear hijab, not all. Hijab is the full attire that you see me wearing, and then women wear it in different ways. Some will cover all of their hair, like you see this young woman doing it, and some wear it like me, and some just tie their scarf in the back. It really depends on the individual. It may be their choice, and it's usually their choice. The only place where I've seen it not be that is in San Francisco among some Yemeni communities where the girls feel like they have to, wear the hijab. And of course, there are limits to how much we can do with that because the families are responsible. But generally, among American Muslims, it's a choice, and oftentimes it's a choice that they make despite what their parents want them to do, because a lot of the parents are concerned about their safety and their security dressed in hijab and identifying in hijab. These kids, unfortunately, also tend to experience a lot of the hate that happens, called ragheads, towelhead. Even I was called a towelhead. I was in Stanford, of all places, getting coffee, waiting in line, and some guy comes up with his girlfriend, and he asked me about the towel on my head. And I thought, what is he talking about? He can't possibly be talking about my hijab. But then I realized that he was. And I took it well. I said, oh, you're talking about my hijab. And then I went into explaining to him what it was. This was Stanford, college years, which was shocking. Yeah, so 36% of respondents who wear hijab report having scarf tugged or other offensive, up from 29% in 2014. So it's incredibly important to be sensitive to what these kids experience, and it may not be happening in front of you in schools. And then some boys wear skull caps, although I don't see it as often as I do with the girls wearing hijab. Gender relations. Some Muslim students may avoid being alone or touching someone of the opposite gender, which has to do a lot with the modesty. And they may be uncomfortable partnering with the opposite gender for that reason. I imagine that this is a common problem, not just with Muslims, but maybe other communities as well, immigrant communities. Or acting out romantic parts if they're in a play or something like that. So you might want to be sensitive to that. Don't make the assumption that that's the case, obviously, for all students, but if you sense that there is something going on, you might want to just have a frank conversation. Are you feeling uncomfortable in this role? Then, but don't make the assumptions, because I don't want to speak obviously for all Muslims. And then sex education, PE. Girls may request to wear long sleeved, and they're accommodated. I see it now everywhere. A lot of the girls in hijab play basketball, play soccer, and they're really good at it too. Boys may request to wear long shorts, which I think is common now for them to wear long shorts. And then both may ask to be excused from swimming, dancing, and sex education as well, which is, and I think that's just common with other students as well. Daily prayers. Now, Muslims have to pray 5 times a day, so usually their noon and afternoon prayer happen during the school hours. And so prayer is observed in any quiet place, and what usually happens is they will go to the school and ask for a private place to pray, and a good school knows to accommodate these kids. And all they need is they can use a towel, they can use a clean cloth. Kids may even carry their prayer rug. I don't know if they actually do that or not. I certainly do, but I'm an adult. And then they have to face a direction, a particular direction, and this is where the Kaaba is. And the Kaaba is a building that Muslims believe was first built by Adam and the angel Gabriel, and then destroyed with the floods of Noah, and then rebuilt by the prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael. It's considered to be sacred, and Muslims face that direction when they pray. In America, it's northeast. Some will pray east, but it's usually northeast that Muslims will pray. And how do I find out which way northeast is? Most people that practice will actually have a prayer app, and in the prayer app you have a compass in the prayer app, believe it or not, and that shows you which direction northeast is, and that's exactly what Muslims do. And I also have a prayer app that tells me when it's time to pray, but I silence it because I'm concerned about it going off in a public space and people overreacting to it or reacting in a negative way, particularly. It's, huh? It's an actual call to prayer.
I would silence that too.
Exactly. Yeah, it's actually called to prayer. When it's gone off in the airport, I've freaked out because I'm like, oh my God, they now know I'm Muslim. Is it? And I've actually had a person who sat next to me. I was going to San Diego, so it was a short trip, and she said to me, I gotta be honest with you. I was talking to this woman quite a bit. I was sitting in the middle seat, and she said to me, I got to be honest with you, when I saw you in the airport, and we were about to land, when I saw you at the airport, I freaked out and I called my daughter and said one of them is about to board and she's carrying a bag with her. And my daughter talked me down and convinced me, Mom, she went through TSA, don't freak out, you know. And I boarded, and then when I saw you sitting next to me, I didn't know what to do with myself. But you sound exactly like me. I'm so glad we talked because, we didn't talk about religion at all. We just talked. And she said, but I got to tell you that I was really freaked out. So there you go. So people do. People are concerned, and I'm very sensitive to that. A lot of Muslims are very sensitive to it, and so they're very careful about how they behave in public. It's sad that I can't do that. I mean, I can't. It is sad because it changes the way that you experience life, really. I don't pray in public anymore. I used to. I don't. Prayer beads are something that I used to actually, like Catholics and Buddhists have prayer. I don't use them anymore. I don't read the Quran in public anymore for all of those reasons when I'm traveling because I know it's a concern and I want to get to my destination. I'm also a very practical person that way as well. So, yeah. So privacy is preferred, not required. And then before they pray, Muslims pray, they actually have to do ablution, which is washing. They wash their hands, their mouth, their nose, their face, wipe the hair, and then they also wash all the way up to the elbows and wash their feet. So some kids will choose a private bathroom to do that, or they might just do it in the bathroom, probably when nobody else is watching. But they do have to be physically also clean to be able to perform the ritual prayer, which is part of the reason why maybe kids will wait until they get home to do it. But a lot of our kids today, especially in a safe place like the Northern California, they do exercise these rights, which is great. But it's because it's also a good school, and the principal and the educators are very comfortable with that diversity. Yeah. And it's very physical in nature. So you begin by standing, and then you bow in humility before God, and then this is the third part, which is you actually go on the ground in humility, you glorify God's name 3 times, and then you stand back up again, and that completes one cycle. So in the afternoon, they are the longest cycled prayers. So both of them are 4 cycles. So, yeah. But kids often will wait until they get home, or they will do it during the school. Now, if they are in high school, Friday is the communal worship prayer, which is like a Christian Sunday morning prayer. Or if you're Jewish, you're in the synagogue on Saturday morning or Friday night, or both. For Muslims, it's Friday noon. And so what happens there? It depends on the high school. Some high schools have a lot of Muslim kids, so the kids have formed a club, and they will actually do the Jummah, the congregational prayer, on school grounds. They bring somebody in from outside, or one of the kids might even want to give the sermon. The sermon can be just 5 to 10 minutes, and then they follow the leader and they pray together. So that happens in some of the high schools. Otherwise, some high schools allow the kids to leave campus. And in that case, then if the kid has a car, can drive, they will do that and then come back to campus.
Another
Yeah.
connection with Christianity that I learned, which really surprised me, was going into the Coptic churches in Egypt
Yeah.
and seeing full prostration.
Ah, yes.
You know, so it started like this, but it was right out on the floor.
That's right.
And I was
Yeah,
taken back,
and the Orthodox
you know.
tradition, you're absolutely right. Pictures of, who's the famous nun who passed away?
India. Right.
In India, yeah, her. I've seen pictures of her in that, and I think she was also, or maybe traditionally in, where she grew up. This is the way, part of their prayer was the full prostration on the floor. Another thing that kids will ask for is that during the month of Ramadan, and Ramadan, it follows an Islamic calendar which moves 11 days earlier every year, right? So this year, Ramadan is going to fall, not this year, in 2020, Ramadan is going to fall in April. This year it fell in May, right? So between now and for the next how many years, a couple of decades, Ramadan is going to fall during the school day. Exactly. Yeah, it's going to be more challenging for kids. Now, these things become required only after the age of puberty. So it really, after the age of puberty. Yeah. And you know, I grew up in a family where I didn't like pray. I didn't fast until I was much older. So it really depends on the family, but there's a lot of kids that will fast and want to fast, and they will play sports as well. And there's nothing that their parents can do about it because they feel that they can, and they do it. Or some kids will just fast half the day or something like that. So it really depends on the family. You know, while not required, many kids fast in emulation of their parents. And then also some of the kids may attend nightly prayers at the mosque, which they may not do, you know, in their parents' home country, but they decide to do it here just because of, well, it's a time also when it's a lot of fun because they get to see all their friends every day, right? And so some of these kids go to the mosque not so much to the prayers, but to just hang out with their, you know, with their friends. But some of them will actually, you know, do that. And so every night during the month of Ramadan, Muslims are reciting 1/30 of the Quran until they complete it. And it's a very, very festive time of year where it's incredibly social as well. And then also it's a time of year when families will eat together. Because imagine if you were fasting the entire day and now it's sunset. You're in the kitchen, you're in your dining room table together. So it's a time that builds family bonds, community bonds, and it's just a social event of the year. And every night you're invited to somebody's home, not every night, but on weekends, Friday, Saturday, Sundays, you're invited over to somebody's home or your parents have invited people over. So it's just very festive. How do you get any work done during that period of time? Well, if you go to Muslim majority countries, they have like half-day works, right? They will go into work like at 10 or 11 and go home at 2 or 3.
I have
an Arab or, oh.
My coworker is a Muslim, and during Ramadan, he would come in for half a day, and go home, and then and I had just started working there the first time, and I was like, does he ever work? like what's going on? And they had to explain to me like what was happening, and he was always tired when he came in, and I was like, when are we ever gonna like actually like work, like get things done? And so, and then like the following month, I was like, oh, so this is normal, and that was okay.
He had his cup of coffee before he's come in.
Yeah, I was like, I don't get it. So
that particular person probably like saved up all of his vacations during that time and was working like part-time. Yeah. So someone like me, so you know, I'm a practicing Muslim, obviously, and you know, I'm quite Orthodox, and I fast throughout the year, like at least once or twice a week. And during the month of Ramadan, I'm up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'm eating, and I drink my coffee, and I'm ready to go. And I will work normal hours, and I'm fine. Actually, what you realize when you're fasting, and it's now become a big diet thing too, where these intermittent fasting days that you do, that you realize that you don't need to eat that much as we do. We eat all the time, you know, we're drinking stuff and we're eating all the time, and that's what you realize. You only like need to just have maybe 2 meals, light meals a day, and you're fine. You're supposed to lose weight, but guess what happens in the Muslim world? They just, I mean, you know, they are not doing it like they're supposed to, but it's because it's just a very festive time of year. It's just tons, people invite each other, and there's a lot of food. Yeah. It is the best time, honestly, to go to visit Muslim majority countries is during the month of Ramadan in terms of the festivities that happen. And then they will be up So they might like take a nap and then they'll get up and eat and they'll be up all night until the next night. So it's like one big party. And sometimes there's street parties too.
I'd just like to share two Ramadan experiences I had, or one really different one, and the rest were sort of the same. So when I was living in Pakistan, and I also lived in Jordan and Egypt, I saw Ramadan in a way that for someone who's non-Muslim was really impressive. People really did go out and work, especially in poorer countries like Pakistan.
Yeah, 'cause they
and
have to.
they, you know, you were not restricted, although you should, out of respect, not eat and drink in front of them.
Yeah.
But I was just so impressed. Then I go and live in Saudi Arabia for 8 years. And Saudi Arabia just turned the whole day upside down. Nobody was suffering there. I really mean it. I mean, maybe the very poor people in upper,
Yeah,
you
that
know,
had to be out there working.
out in the
Yeah.
Yemenis and that, but you know,
Yeah.
but not the Saudis.
Yeah.
They would nothing was open all day long. It was
Yeah.
just very,
Wow.
again, another thing to share about the differences.
Yeah.
You know, have you ever?
No.
You've probably gone Hajj.
No, I've gone on Umrah,
Right.
not Hajj, but yeah.
Yeah,
But I've
so
not
if you
been
live,
there during
it's
the month of
amazing.
Ramadan, yeah.
It's not
interesting.
really the way I would look at
Egypt,
Ramadan.
I'm telling you, all the best shows come out
Yeah.
during the month of
Yeah.
Ramadan in Egypt. The best movies are produced. I
And
swear
it
to
is
God,
it's
like
party
a
time at night, yeah.
It is, and at night, especially in Egypt, right?
Yeah.
And the restaurants are just like, it's like it's one big. Now, the ideal about the month of Ramadan, it's about commemorating the revelation of the Quran, and you're supposed to be in a state of self-reflection, your atonement, right? So imagine this, and you're fasting as a remembrance of all of this. Fasting is the easy part. The harder part is controlling your behavior. So if you're someone who's impulsive or gets angry, who backbites, common problem everywhere in the world, you're supposed to try to control your tongue, control everything that you do to create a better character. And you do this every day to have it become a habit. That's what Ramadan is about. It's not about partying, right? But and it just has become more cultural than, unfortunately, but depends on the, I guess, the country that you go to. I've only experienced it in Egypt and obviously in the United States. I've not been to Indonesia. I don't know what they do there. I've not been to other parts of the Muslim world. I'm sure that it's different for, you know, everywhere. But the idea is, it's a very, very spiritual. The first 2 days of fasting, you are freaking out because you're thinking, this is in the old days when I wasn't doing what I'm doing today, which is I fast all the time. I used to say, I will never be able to do this, and I dreaded it. I dreaded it. It's like, can you imagine like not eating and drinking? And then once you're in it, like you don't want it to end because it's such a beautiful time of year for Muslims if you're part of a community. It's a very, very festive. Imagine Christmas like every day for a month.
Right.
Exactly. And then at the end of the Ramadan is the Eid, which is, well, so back to this. Fasting students may request to spend lunchtime in the library, be excused from strenuous activity, but I'm telling you, American Muslim kids are incredible. They're totally resilient, and they like want to do these things. If younger kids save treats from parties, and then have an opportunity to explain Ramadan to the class. We have one of the PowerPoints that we have is a Ramadan PowerPoint that kids can share. We have a whole website dedicated to Muslim teens to have these PowerPoints for them to present, which are like 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, and then we have adult stuff that teachers can use. And we have tons of lesson plans as well for educators. I wish, just download the handout that's up online. And then the holidays are remarkable. In the United States, they're only celebrated for 1 day, but in Muslim majority countries, they're 3 to 4 days. And they will take off all those days. And what happens, how Christmas here is celebrated, in the sense that you go to the mosque in the morning, you listen to a sermon, you do congregational prayer, and then the rest of the day you're visiting family and friends. And the people that get gifts are the young kids, not the adults. Muslim calendars, Muslim holidays are, as I said, they are lunar-based calendars, and holidays in the classroom. incredibly important, especially for K through 6 or K through 7 teachers that do a lot of holidays, cultural events. Really important to recognize the holidays of the that represent the kids in the class, obviously, right? So include the Buddhists, include the Hindu, include the Muslim, the Jewish, and everybody. And some students may not participate in other holiday celebrations, although they may want their holiday to be recognized. And that usually comes from the parents. But I think that if you, as an educator, create that environment, the kids will want to participate. And I think it's a good learning opportunity for the kids. Vacation time for Hajj or Umrah, this is if you're going on Hajj, usually that's a couple of weeks off, and that's usually worked out by the, by the parents. Resources for educators. Now we're getting into, if you're teaching social studies and world history. As I said, we have tons of stuff specifically for social studies teachers. And we also have speakers bureaus. Now, you may not know this, but teaching about religion is required in all 50 states. But it's about religion in the context of social studies and world history. And you have to abide by certain rules. And those rules are, you cannot teach, you cannot preach or proselytize. Incredibly important for educators, but also for every speaker that you bring into the classroom. You can only inform about religion. You cannot have the kids join you or live the, oh, I'm going to expose you to Islam by having you experience what it is to be a Muslim or what it is to be a Jewish. I've seen speakers do that, and it's a major problem. Because kids can't distinguish between, younger kids can't distinguish between what the school promotes and what the teacher is doing. So incredibly important that the speaker follows these guidelines. And the rest of this goes into what ING offers, my organization offers, the speakers bureaus, the interfaith speakers bureaus, and then we have tons of online curriculum that we offer for teachers for free. You have to be a teacher though, and we verify it on the school website to make sure. We're based in San Jose, but we have chapters in different parts, not in New Hampshire. In Michigan and Colorado we do. And you can find all of that up on our website, and everything is free for educators on our website. And it's all vetted as far as the separation of church and state and how to teach about religion. So we're very sensitive to that. And I'm going to stop here. We're just sharing one other thing, and we're about to put up Islamophobia. But we have online answers to FAQs. We have about 200 answers to 200 questions, which is very, very helpful to educators. And I'll go ahead and stop here. I think my time, I only have about 5 minutes left. Okay, so questions. You've been asking me questions throughout, though.
Thoughts about, again, keying up the notion of I don't know whether you would call this implicit bias, and you two are too young to remember this, but there was a movie, I think you and I probably do, Midnight Express.
Yes.
1978, about Turkey and drugs.
Yeah.
Every time the American or anyone white was tortured, they had the call of prayer. You go back and look at that and listen. It's amazing. So that was something I really noticed back in the day, and I was living overseas then.
Yeah.
The other thing is a comment about the Uyghurs in China.
Yeah.
There's also the Hazaras in Baluchistan who are suffering from Sunni Muslims because they follow Shia Islam. So I'm just trying to point out, like you were saying, I mean, all these differences, right? It's not monolithic. And people are often their own worst enemy in terms of they follow a religion, but they're unkind to each other.
The problem is when the media universalizes it as being that's what Islam stands for. Right?
And the last thing I wanted to say was we do have in New Hampshire, you're right, we don't have anything like this, great to get it. We do have great speakers who come around, and there's one man in particular who lives there, and he's Muslim. He's a journalist, and he goes around to all the churches and schools and colleges with a program called Ask a Muslim. So he walks in and he just answers anyone's questions, and it's delightful. People really feel comfortable.
It's great. The only concern I would have is that people are going to probably ask a question based on stereotypes. If I were him, refer him to ING's website and show him. I do have a card. I can give you my card. And refer him to our website and have him at least give an intro before he does that, because he reframes the conversation.
Right, you need to put a frame on it to begin with.
Yeah.
He actually, I've seen him in 3 different talks, and he does, and then often.
Sorry. I've seen this gentleman in 3 different versions of his talk, and he does, but often he brings it out as the questions come.
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, he's freelancing because you know, he has no program.
No,
that,
I mean, listen,
but I will give
for,
him your
for doing that. But just incredibly important to reframe, because then you're operating with people's frames, which are oftentimes quite stereotypical.
Implicit bias.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Implicit bias. Yeah. So anything that I can do to help, I think my contact information is also there. We offer our stuff via webinar as well. So we've had, I don't know if it was New Hampshire, but Massachusetts, we've done many school districts in Massachusetts via webinar. And it's really cool because the speaker appears like this with a PowerPoint next to them, and it's as if they're there, and they can hear the person coordinating, and they can hear, obviously everybody in the audience can hear the speaker as if they were there. So we've done that because of the incredible demand and need to do this. So we're available for you, and we provide it really for free.
Well, CAST has a yearly symposium, and I would be interested in having a presentation there, because what we do is not diverse enough.
Yeah.
And we're talking about all kinds of issues of inclusion and diversity.
Yeah.
But, you know, we need more people at the table. And that includes people who dress like you. And, you know, I mean, this is all, you know, this comes down to education at some point. So we need more representatives.
Especially now, because there are forces in this country that are trying to divide us and making us believe things that are just false about each other. It's just false. I refuse to view white people the way that certain people want me to view them, as I resist being described or defined by others. And so the only way that we can do that is just to resist and to understand that this is a shared issue concerning all Americans. We're living with narratives that we did not create, and we have to overcome them, because that's the only way towards peace. You know, we don't want to go through a war to create peace, which is where we're going. Thank you so much. Appreciate it very much.